Bloomberg LP Appellant and ZXC Respondent.
Lord Hamlin will explain the decision of the court.
The central issue on this appeal is whether, in general, a person under criminal investigation has, prior to being charged, a reasonable expectation of privacy in respect of information relating to that investigation. This is an issue which has been considered by the lower courts in a number of cases, such as, for example, the case involving Cliff Richard and the BBC, but this is the first time that it has had to be addressed by the Supreme Court. The factual context in which the issue falls to be considered involves the publication of an article, by the appellant Bloomberg, a well-known international media company, concerning a criminal investigation by a UK legal enforcement body, the UKLEB, into the respondent, ZXC, and the company for whom he worked, X Limited, in relation to their activities in a foreign state. To assist in that investigation, the UKLEB sent a confidential letter of request, the letter, to the authorities of the foreign state, seeking, among other things, information and documents relating to ZXC. The letter expressly requested that its existence and contents remain confidential. Bloomberg obtained a copy of the letter, and the article was almost exclusively drawn from it. ZXC claimed that he had a reasonable expectation of privacy in relation to 1. The fact that the UKLEB had requested information relating to him in the context of its investigations, and 2. The details of the matters that the UKLEB was investigating in relation to him. The first instance judge held that Bloomberg had published private information that was in principle protected by Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights, the ECHR, and that in balancing ZXC's rights against Bloomberg's right to freedom of expression under Article 10 ECHR, the balance favoured ZXC. Bloomberg's appeal against that judgment was dismissed by the Court of Appeal. Bloomberg now appeals to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court unanimously dismisses the appeals. Lord Stevens and I give the sole judgment with which the other justices agree. In its judgment, the Court sets out the general principles governing the tort of misuse of private information. As was common ground, this is a distinct tort where liability is determined by applying a two-stage test. Stage 1 is whether the claimant, objectively, has a reasonable expectation of privacy in the relevant information, considering all the circumstances of the case. Such circumstances are likely to include, but are not limited to, those identified in the Court of Appeal decision in Murray and Express newspapers, the so-called Murray factors. If so, stage 2 is whether that expectation is outweighed by the publisher's right to freedom of expression. This involves a balancing exercise between the claimant's Article 8 ECHR right to privacy and the publisher's Article 10 ECHR right to freedom of expression, having due regard to Section 12 of the Human Rights Act. The first and main issue on the appeal concerns the Stage 1 test and whether the Court of Appeal was correct to hold that as a general rule or legitimate starting point, a person under criminal investigation has, prior to being charged, a reasonable expectation of privacy in respect of information relating to that investigation. As the Court explains, it is widely accepted as a matter of public policy that there is a negative effect on an innocent person's reputation in publishing that he or she is being investigated by the police or another state organisation. There is a uniform general practice by state investigatory bodies not to identify those under investigation prior to charge. Additionally, several first instance judgments have accepted the private nature of such information based on the potential that its publication would ordinarily cause substantial damage to the person's reputation and other damage. Bloomberg advanced 4 arguments challenging the general rule or legitimate starting point in relation to this category of information, all of which the court rejects. First, Bloomberg relied on the public's ability to observe the presumption of innocence, a legal presumption applicable to criminal trials. But, in this different context, the question is how others, including a person's inner circle, will react to the publication of information that that person is under criminal investigation. It is undeniable that a person's reputation would ordinarily be adversely affected, impacting their right to respect for private life, such as the right to establish and develop relationships with other people. Second, Bloomberg argued that the court's reliance below on the human characteristic to equate suspicion or investigation with guilt, on the assumption that there is no smoke without fire, runs contrary to well-established principles in defamation law. But ZXC did not bring a claim in defamation. The tort of misuse of private information is a separate tort with different constituent elements and a distinct purpose. Unlike in defamation, the purpose of the tort of misuse of private information is not only to protect an individual from the publication of untrue information. Rather, its purpose is to protect an individual's private life in accordance with Article 8 ECHR, regardless of the truth or falsity of the information, and it is therefore inappropriate simply to read across concepts from the tort of defamation. Third, Bloomberg submitted that information relating to ZXC's business activities should not be protected. This is an unduly restrictive view of the protection afforded by Article 8 ECHR, which can include professional or business activities. A person's reputation is within the scope of their Article 8 ECHR private life, provided the attack on reputation attains a certain level of seriousness and prejudices a person's right to respect for private life. Fourth, Bloomberg argued that the courts below failed to have appropriate regard to the activity in which ZXC was engaged, namely alleged corruption in relation to ZXC's company's activities in a foreign country. The nature of the activity in which ZXC was engaged is not a factor of particular significance here. The courts below gave due consideration to the applicable Murray factors in their multifactorial analysis, including ZXC's status as a businessman involved in the affairs of a large public company. While ZXC's status might mean that the limits of acceptable criticism are wider than for a private individual, there is a limit. The factor is not in itself determinative and should only form part of the Stage 1 analysis. It follows that the courts below were correct to hold that, as a legitimate starting point, a person under criminal investigation has, prior to being charged, a reasonable expectation of privacy in respect of information relating to that investigation, and that in all the circumstances, this is a case in which that applies and there is such an expectation. The second issue is whether the Court of Appeal was wrong to hold that in a case in which a claim for breach of confidence was not pursued, the fact that Bloomberg published information originating from a confidential law enforcement document rendered the information private and/or undermined Bloomberg's ability to rely on the public interest in its disclosure. The short answer to this issue is that the Court of Appeal did not so hold. The judge was right to treat the letter's confidentiality as a relevant and important factor at both Stage 1 and Stage 2, and neither the judge nor the Court of Appeal treat it as being determinative. The third issue is whether the Court of Appeal was wrong to uphold the findings of the first instance judge, but since this ground of appeal is dependent upon Bloomberg establishing that the Court of Appeal erred in law on the first and/or second issue, it too must be rejected. The appeal is accordingly dismissed.
This is a case in which reporting restrictions were imposed by the High Court and the Court of Appeal. Those restrictions remain in force, and information about them can be obtained from this court. The court will now be adjourned.